In this episode of Home Built Workshop, we're going to dive right into a fun project of creating a whole bunch of Walnut award plaques for an upcoming ranch horse equestrian event. These things will be used to honor and award the participants and winners of the different categories. A lot of work ahead of us, so let's get started. Make sure you stick around. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to this episode of Home Built Workshop. I hope all of you are doing awesome today. Boy, have we got a project of epic proportions in store for you today. And I only say epic proportions because I got to build a lot of these plaques and I don't have a whole lot of space to work in. So, scope of this project compared to shop space, I think makes it pretty epic, at least here at Home Built Workshop. This particular project is on an extremely condensed timeline. There's a big event going on where these things need to be completed so they can be handed out as awards to the winners of the different categories. I only have a few weeks to get this done. In order to save some time during the filming process, I'm not going to be able to do a dedicated video with perfect audio and all of that. I'm going to mostly use the GoPro and probably my phone to just capture a bunch of snippets of the different processes along the way. There's a lot of them, so trying to capture a little bit of each step I think is going to be a challenge while still maintaining our production and getting these things done on time. So I've captured a whole lot of footage because, as you can probably guess, since I'm holding this here, I've already completed most of these. So I wanted to document this process for myself and also share it with you guys so you can see kind of some of the steps that go into creating this thing. So as the great Jerry Reed once said, we've got a long way to go and a short time to get there. So let's not waste any time and get started. The first thing we're going to need is a boatload of black walnut. I began this project by ordering 100 board feet of walnut from a local hardwood supplier in my area. I have no room to move in here. This is going to be quite the project. Let's start cutting this up. And kicking this project off brings us right into the first challenge for working in my tiny shop. I need to get these pieces ripped down to about a 2.5-inch width so that I can glue them up in a panel later on. Now ideally, I would run these through the table saw and rip them all into long strips, but I don't have the infeed nor the outfeed space to do that on the table saw. So the route that I'm taking is to block these up into their individual lengths, then I can rip those lengths down at the table saw. This method is way less efficient, but hey, we gotta work with what we have here. Here in the video, I'm trying to show this process in the actual order of operations, but if the truth be told, I actually was doing a lot of this simultaneously. I would cut several pieces to length, then rip them to width, then glue them up, and then I'd just keep repeating that process, slowly working through my stack of lumber. Once I had enough pieces cut, I clamped them together and sent them through the drum sander on edge. This was kind of the same thing as running them across the jointer. I could sand each glue surface nice and flat, and this way I could effectively joint all the edges of one piece at a time. With the edges jointed on these pieces, it's time to get them glued together. This part of the process was one step where it was really just a standard panel glue up. Apply glue to the edges, smooth it out, make sure you have good glue coverage, and apply a bunch of clamps. There's one. Now I just have to do this, what, 36 more times? I'm going to be at this a while. And here I'm working on the second of the two sizes. This one's a little bit larger, but the construction process is exactly the same. It uses the same thickness of material. It's just a different shape once we're done. You'll probably notice throughout this video that one time I may be working on this particular piece, another time I may be working on a totally different plaque, and really that's just because it just happens to be what I'm working on at the time I turned on the camera. That is a lot of gluing. In total, I'm doing 32 of the smaller, kind of diamondy square ones, and I'm doing 5 of these larger ones. So in total, I got 37 plaques that we're making. We're almost done gluing. I got just a few more left. After all the gluing was complete, I need to get these things flattened so that I can cut out the shape on the CNC machine. To flatten them out, I ran them through my drum sander with a really coarse 40 grit belt, just to remove all of the excess glue, any high spots, and make sure that they were nice and flat. The tricky part here is the fact that these pieces are wider than the overall width of my drum sander. So in order to make one pass, I actually have to flip the piece around and make a second pass. So if you multiply that by 32 of these pieces, this step alone took quite a while. But eventually I got the pieces flat, and then we went straight to the CNC machine to start cutting out the final shape. I think this project is pretty cool because it uses all 3 of what I call the trifecta of digital manufacturing. We're using the CNC machine to cut out the shapes, we're going to use the laser engraver to engrave the text, and at the end we'll use the 3D printer to print the centerpiece that goes on each of these plaques. I just thought that was pretty cool. I don't think I've done a project before that uses all 3 of the trifecta. It's kind of like the great Johnny Cash once sang, one piece at a time. I only have 4 more big ones to cut once this one's done. We're getting close. That's the last one of this size. Now I gotta trim all this waste material away. The waste material is held on by just a few tabs on each side, but to try to make this quicker, I'm just using the bandsaw to run right down the cut line, cut all the tabs loose, and release the waste material. I'm gonna have to do a little bit of cleanup so I don't trip over this stuff. But now that all these are cut to their final size, I got these little nubs left on here from the little tabs. I'm gonna clean those up using a flush trim bit and my little router table. After cutting out the last of these pieces, I needed to run them back through the drum sander to bring them down to final thickness. But I realized that each one of these is going to take forever on my drum sander since my drum sander is not wide enough to do this whole thing in one pass. So I had to call on my buddy Matt to give me a hand. He's got a wider drum sander, so I hauled all of these things over to his shop. We ran them through his drum sander to get everything nice and flat. We could do it all in one pass. I didn't have to flip it part way. So I got to give a huge shout out to my buddy Matt, Zimbelman Guitars. Thanks for the help, man. I really appreciate it. Your help saved me a ton of time. Probably, no joke, at least a day, maybe 2 or even 3, but definitely 1 full day, probably even more. Thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate your help. Well, it's really starting to look like a plaque factory around here. Look at all these blanks. Now I need to route a cove relief in here. Really just this little shape around the outside. These are a couple test pieces that I've already done just to make sure that I've got the router set. I'm going to do this in at least 2 passes, maybe 3. I don't want to take the full cut because I don't want to risk taking too much off and maybe chipping a corner out or something like that. So probably going to set this up as a time lapse because this is going to take a little bit. It's going to make a huge mess. I've tried to put a few things around my router table to kind of contain some of the dust. I don't think that's probably going to work all that great, but we're going to get this done. A couple of passes to get this routed down to the final depth. I got 30 something here and another 5 or 6 here. Let's get this done. At least this step anyway. I'm not sure why the camera's got a little bit of a weird color going on here. Maybe there's a different setting for the time lapse. I tried to capture as much of this process as I could because I thought it'd be kind of neat to see the dirt and dust piling up, but in typical GoPro fashion, the battery died, so I only captured the first half or so of this process. I'm using a 3/8 cove bit to cut the cove, and I ended up using 2 passes to get to my final depth. And it seems like every step of this particular project makes a huge mess. That made a huge mess. Sorry, there's even some there. I hope it didn't get any in your eye. I gotta do a little bit of cleanup before we can move on to the next step. And for that next step, we're moving back to the CNC machine to cut the keyhole slot in the back, which will be used for hanging. To make this process quicker, of course, I've created a little jig where I can quickly pop the piece into place, hit play on the CNC machine, and using a keyhole bit, very quickly and easily cut the keyhole. One down, 36 more to go. A little sanding will remove the fuzzies around the keyhole with no problem. And unfortunately, sanding is what's going to happen next. There are a lot of pieces to sand, a lot of edges to sand, a lot of coves to sand. This is going to take a while. Thankfully, I have some awesome buddies who volunteered to come and help me with a little bit of a sanding party, can we call it? I need to give a huge shout out to my friends Mark and Jesse, who both came and helped me on different days with a lot of this sanding. It would have taken me probably days again longer if I was sanding this all by myself. So again, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jesse, for coming and helping me out with this dusty process. I really appreciate your help, and it made a huge difference in the success of this project. You can see here in this time lapse that Jesse and I are sanding outside. We're trying to stay outside because I've already begun some of the finishing process inside, and I'm trying to work out of the dust, keep the dust down inside so that I get a good finish. Plus, it's kind of nice that the wind just kind of blows the dust away. It actually ended up working out really well. Like a lot of other parts of this project, the next several steps were happening simultaneously. Once we had a piece fully sanded, it went straight to the laser engraver and got some special text and things engraved into the wood. Once that piece was off and running in the laser, I went back to doing more sanding and finishing, kind of all at the same time, trying to keep the ball rolling and keep all of the processes moving forward. And as you can tell here, it's dark out. There were several days where I worked well past dark trying to keep these things going. After the laser robot had finished doing its job, these pieces had to go back and be lightly sanded on the top. A lot of times when you do laser engraving on wood, you get at least what I call smoke staining around the letters, and a light sanding with some 320 cleans that up and makes everything look nice and crisp. The last step before the finishing process can begin is to use a template that I 3D printed to mark the layout of the holes that'll hold the centerpiece on each of these plaques. There's about 6 different versions of centerpieces that'll go on different plaques depending on what category the plaque is for. I've just 3D printed this little template that has the bolt holes in it. I can line that up, center punch the holes, and drill them out on the drill press. With the holes drilled, we're ready for finish. Now I'm going to do something that I don't normally do. We're going to apply a little bit of a stain. This is a gel stain, and really the only reason for this is because there's some variation in color in this walnut, and by adding a stain, it helps even that out a little bit so you don't get such a sharp contrast between some of the lighter wood and some of the super dark wood. Just makes everything look a little bit more even. This stuff's pretty cool. This is a gel stain made by General Finishes. It looks like chocolate pudding. It does make me want some chocolate pudding. I've only used a gel stain like this maybe once or twice before. It's not something I use very often. It's actually quite easy to apply. I'm just applying it with a regular old cheapy foam brush. Now I know it looks really dark here, but the kind of cool thing about this is you just brush it on and then you take a rag and you wipe off the excess. And it lightens right back up to almost that walnut color that we all love so much. But you don't get quite the sharp contrast between the lighter pieces and the darker pieces. At least it all has more of an even tone. You can still tell that there's separate pieces in there, but it's not such a stark contrast. Once all the pieces are stained, it's time for a top coat. For that, I'm going to use spray lacquer. This is my all-time favorite spray lacquer. I've used it so many times, although the can never looked like this before. This is basically Deft spray lacquer. It's a PPG product that's recently been rebranded. Now ideally, I would set all of these pieces up at the same time and spray them with a spray gun. That would be the most efficient way to get this job done. However, I only have a few of these available for finish at any time. So if I were to spray these with a spray gun, I would have to stop when I'm done spraying 2 or 3, clean the spray gun, get a few more ready, get the spray gun dirty again, and I would be spending so much time in between coats cleaning the spray gun that, in my mind, it just doesn't make sense for this process. My first coat is actually a double coat. I'm spraying a nice heavy coverage going one direction, then I'm switching my direction of spray 90 degrees and applying a second coat. It is not all that difficult to get an awesome finish using a spray can, especially of this particular lacquer. What I found to work best for me is to use a 50% overlap in my spray pattern as I'm spraying. This gets really good coverage and the finish lays down nice and flat. It really turns out nice. One benefit of using lacquer like this is it dries really fast, which, especially for this project, since we don't have a lot of time, that's really important. After my first double coat has dried, I'm going to grab some 320 sandpaper and using a hand sand pad, I'll just sand it lightly just to remove any rough spots in the finish. Boy, it's a good thing that I enjoy sanding, because this project has an awful lot of it. Oh, and if I look tired, it's because I'm running on about 4 hours of sleep. Last night I worked on these till 1 o'clock in the morning, as the deadline is fast approaching. That's all right. We're making good progress. I'll just wipe off all the dust, and we can get back to spraying the final coat, or final double coats. let's spray. For the final coat, I'm using exactly the same process I used for the initial coat. Again, spraying one coat one direction, changing 90 degrees, and spraying another coat, and then I just let it sit. Once the back side is dry, then I'll flip the piece over and repeat that exact same process for the top. I always start with the back. Let's get out of here, it smells bad. Inside the center of each of these plaques, there's going to be a little 3D printed mold or 3D printed model, and it's going to vary depending on the class that each plaque is for. I was doing some math, and to do all of these 3D prints, it was going to take my Creality Ender 3 37 days, day and night, to print all of these things. I don't have 37 days, day and night, to print all these things, so we had to make a bit of an upgrade. I ended up picking up the Bamboo Labs X1 Carbon 3D printer. This thing is so much faster than my Ender 3. Not that there's anything wrong with the Ender 3. It's worked great, but we got to pick up the pace on this production, and this Bamboo Labs machine is going to do just that. It prints in amazing quality, and it's pretty cool that it has the AMS sitting on top, which allows me to load several rolls of filament, so that way in the middle of the night, if a spool runs out, it'll just switch to the next one and keep going. I don't have to worry about staying up late trying to keep the filament rolls filled. It'll just keep on going. I didn't do any sort of setup video or anything on that, but if there's anything you'd like to know about this printer, or really anything in this video for that matter, if you want to see a certain particular piece in a little bit more detail, let me know. Leave it down in the comments, and I'll try to do a separate video covering a little bit more of whatever it is you want to know. Because I know this video is kind of high level, just overview of the whole process. So let me know down below if you want to see any particular subject in a little bit more in-depth video. Once each of the prints came off of the 3D printer, I used a special tip in my soldering iron to install some heat set inserts. Basically what happens is the soldering iron heats up this little brass knurled insert and it melts it into the recess in the back of the print. I added these holes to the back of the model, especially sized for these particular inserts. This is a very quick way to add an extremely secure threaded hole to a 3D print. And I already have some other ideas for ways I can use some of these heat set inserts for other projects. Now I know it's kind of hard to tell in this clip, but after installing the threaded inserts, each piece gets painted with an antique bronze spray paint. I did find out that it is extremely important to shake this particular paint extremely well before using. If you don't shake it very much, the color doesn't mix well and it looks basically just like black paint. Once that bronze paint dries, then we can move on to what I almost think is my favorite part, or the most satisfying part. We're going to take this bronze painted 3D print and add some gold colored accents, which really brings out a lot of the details in the 3D print and makes it look very similar to an actual bronze casting. I'm using a product called Rub and Buff. It's some sort of blend of oil and waxes that dries almost instantly. A tiny little bit applied to this little foam blobber thingy, that's a technical term, and then we're just going to carefully brush it very lightly on the details that we want to highlight. And hopefully you can tell here how it's highlighted certain portions of the print, and it really looks awesome. With the wooden plaque complete and the print is ready to go, all we need to do now is use some screws and attach the print to the wooden plaque. I think that looks really good, and this particular plaque is done. So that's my process for creating these award plaques. Keep in mind that the steps in the video, I kind of showed one at a time, but for every step in the video, I had to do that 37 times, which actually ended up being 40 because I have 3 more back here that were last minute additions that I need to get the finish applied. I need to give some additional shout outs for this particular project because without a lot of help, I wouldn't have got this done. I want to thank Mike Johnson and his nephew for helping me with some 3D file creation. I had these files that I had to work with, and this one in particular was giving me a hard time, and Mike and his nephew were able to help me out, so thank you so much, Mike. Also, I mentioned my friend Mark and Jesse in the video. Thanks a lot to you guys. I really appreciate your help with all of the sanding. And lastly, I got to give a huge shout out to my wife Gina and daughter Haley. They both jumped in, helped out with a lot of things. Gina helped with applying some of the accents to this, as well as a lot of the packaging, as well as my daughter Haley. And she also helped with some of the 3D printer stuff as well. So thank you guys for your help. I really appreciate it. This was a very tight deadline to get it done, and I definitely wouldn't have got it done without all of your help. So I hope you guys enjoyed this plaque factory video. Definitely was a fun project, a lot of work. We got it done. Let me know what you think down below in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time. Pretty cool.